Hey everyone, welcome back to MCReviews Monstercat 004 Identity, Episode 3. Today we're going to be looking at Run Away From Me, the debut track from DotEXE. DotEXE is an interesting artist, to say the least. He has some great tracks like Battle Cry, but some really bad ones like Inside Out. So to say that he's a mixed bag would be an understatement. Something that he does really well as an artist is communicate a pretty consistent and unique personality through most of his music, which is the thing that even some of Monstercat's biggest producers haven't been able to successfully do. His songs seem stringed together by a kind of over-the-top and boisterous theme, with some of his songs even falling at times into the category of obnoxious and annoying, and I'm looking at you, Hipster Cutthroat and Inside Out. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, as being able to tailor such specific themes and emotions consistently into a group of tracks is an impressive feat. Another interesting fact about DotEXE as an artist is his recent transformation into the world of pop EDM with Summer Was Fun. And so most of you listening should know that I'm not the biggest fan of poppy music, and as such indie dance isn't really my thing. So I'm not a big fan of Summer Was Fun as an artist, but I do quite like Hold On. But all the rest of his songs are pretty unbearable to me, and I vastly prefer the far more, how should I put it, challenging music that he would put out as DotEXE. But in a strange irony, his very first track, all the way back in 2011, is the closest he came to that current indie dance pop sound as DotEXE, and that song is what I'm going to be reviewing today, Run Away From Me by DotEXE. So the intro of the song starts out quite chilled out. It has quite a cool glitchy background beat, which is quite light and quiet. There are quite a few pulsating sort of melodies with generic, happy sounding, melodic stuff happening on top of it. Soon into the track, a riser triggers a few more melodies to pop into the track, and these melodies kind of remind me of almost a video game 8-bit sound. These new melodies make me think quite a bit of something you might hear in a Pokemon game. Very suddenly, the build-up happens at about 30 seconds into the track, and the beat starts getting heavier and faster. Little chops of the main vocals pop in and out, which are cool. There are a couple of generic risers, a couple of kind of cool melodies that build up, and a very distorted and vocoded voice which says "Run Away From Me," which triggers the beginning of the drop. While I haven't said too much on this intro, it's not that it's that basic, and the melodies are quite cool, and it sounds pretty unique, especially for its time in Monstercat. The beat is pretty cool as it's quite complex, and a bit more glitchy than the type you'd hear in most tracks, and the build-up wasn't bad either. It was quite a melodic build-up that was brief and didn't rely on rises too much. The intro is short, coming in at only 45 seconds until the drop, and for the most part, while not blowing me away, it was inoffensive and achieved what it was going for. My only major issue with this intro is that the rest of the song is that I don't really like the vibe that the song goes for. It's very happy and upbeat, which is a style that can work well, but here it just sort of does nothing for me and leaves the intro feeling pretty boring. But besides that, the intro is pretty alright. So now we find ourselves in the first drop, and the first thing anyone will notice when listening to this track is that the main vocal chop pretty much takes over the entire drop. This vocal chop is very distorted and vocoded to the point where it's pretty much incoherent, and hearing any lyrics is difficult. These vocals do sound interesting though. They are fast and range between high and low quite frequently, and are the main part of the drop, pretty much carrying the song. While these vocals aren't amazing, they're quite inventive for the time, as they are the first of their kind on the label. Everything behind the main vocal is quite basic. There's a very thuddy and soft sounding drum step beat. It's pretty good and has a nice level of delay, which adds an interesting stilted type of pace to the track. Unfortunately, drum step is a pretty average genre and is often very unremarkable. And besides the vocal chops in this drop, this song would fall into that category. Accompanying the beat and vocal chops are an array of backing melodies which, in all honesty, are incredibly forgettable and mainly do nothing besides filling up the track. After 20 seconds of these few elements repeating a couple times A white noise fade-in triggers a few new melodies to pop into the track. There's nothing major, just a few of the Pokemon-like melodies from the intro which pop in and add a little more melodic complexity to the track, but not much by any means. Another 20 seconds pass and another white noise fade-in triggers another change, this time a more significant one. The beat is sped up to sound like more of a drum and bass speed, adding quite a bit of drive to the track, but only a few seconds after this addition the drop begins fading out and leading into the midsection of the track. It may sound like I'm being very harsh, calling most of the drop outside of the vocal chop forgettable. That really isn't all that bad of a thing. The song knows what it is, and it's almost entirely based around that vocal chop. This song isn't trying to be anything more than that vocal chop, and that's fine. The issue is that if you don't absolutely love that vocal chop, the song will have very little to offer you, and unfortunately, while I don't hate it by any means, this vocal chop still doesn't particularly thrill me, and as such the drop doesn't either. With that being said, I found the beat pretty cool, and it had a nice variation with the slow as well as the fast pacing from time to time, and the little drum and bass like part of the end was nice. But even that quite good beat doesn't save this drop from being pretty damn mediocre. The track goes into a midsection which mainly consists of the Pokemon-like melodies that were heard during the intro of the track. The vocals from the drop are chopped up and placed at certain points, and there is a pretty slow hi-hat beat. A white noise riser brings in a bunch more melodies from the intro and add a fair bit more complexity to what so far has been a decently basic part of the song. The second build-up happens in pretty much the same way as the first. There are a couple of small differences, but there's nothing that makes any sort of a substantial difference. And so before we get into the second drop of the song, this midsection is pretty much the same as the intro, just with a more boring beat. Some of the melodies in this part are cool and dreamy, but for the most part, this midsection is really mediocre and doesn't try anything all that special or interesting. And then the second drop happens, and for a minute or so, it is the exact same as the first. And again, I'm not amazed by this part. The vocal chop is unique and kinda cool, but everything else for this is mostly forgettable and boring, which is further emphasized by this being a repeated drop. But when the changes do begin is at about 1 minute into the drop, where the drums begin to speed up, and a rudimentary build-up is formed right in the middle of the drop. While this build-up isn't the best thing ever, it's not terrible, and I really like that it's placed in such a strange place as what should be the middle of a drop. This build-up begins what I guess you could call the third drop, and this drop is thankfully quite different to the others, as unlike the rest of the song, which was drum step, this drop is pretty much the superior older brother of drum step, drum and bass. So this seemingly small addition of speeding up the BPM and changing the beat ends up making a large difference. And while not much else has changed about the song here, the faster pace and more interesting beat ends up adding a lot to this part of the song, being the definite highlight of the track. So the song comes to an end by slowing the beat down and beginning to remove elements until a soft beat and few dreamy melodies are all that remain. Those elements in turn fade out to end the track. So that was Run Away From Me, the debut track from DotEXE, and while I don't love the track by any means, it's certainly a hell of a lot more interesting than most of the tracks I've reviewed so far. It's a good example of how strange DotEXE can be, and how he seems pretty willing to try new and kinda weird things that mightn't have worked, and I respect that a lot in an artist. So to get into what I liked about this track, though I wasn't its biggest fan, I can't deny that the use of vocal chops in this track are pretty unique for the time, and it was Monstercat's first track that was heavily based around these vocal chops. This paved the way for artists who would come to use this style to great effect, like Mr. Fijiwiji, Solero, Nigel Good, and Direct. I also, for the most part, liked the beats in this track. The first and second drop had a slow drum step beat with a good amount of delay and glitchiness to keep it interesting, and then drum and bass bit in the third drop was really well done and made that portion of the track many times more enjoyable. But when it comes to the things I dislike about this track, there's probably a lot more I could say. Well, the vocal chop was certainly unique and maybe quite interesting for the history of Monstercat. This doesn't mean that it sounds good. The chop is repeated many times throughout the track, and it's quite high-pitched. Over the 2 or so hours it took me to write this review, I've heard this track many times over in order to fully understand and accurately review it. Unfortunately, that led to me getting really sick of the vocal chop, and by the time of writing this, I'm hoping to never hear it again. The track as a whole also just felt quite basic. It, besides the vocal chop, didn't push any interesting ideas, and the track was far too reliant on those vocals to stay interesting, as almost everything else that surrounded it was really boring and forgettable. The fact that the second drop was the same as the first was also quite a bit of a bummer. Another far more subjective criticism, that I'm not even sure you could call a criticism, is that I'm just not the biggest fan of the vibe of this track. The really happy, loud, and kind of outspoken nature of the song just doesn't really work for me. The style has been done really well in the past, but here it ends up leaving most of the track just really boring for me. So while this isn't really a negative or a positive, something interesting to point out about Runaway From Me is that it isn't hard to tell that the drop, and by extension the vocal chop, was where the priority of this track lies. You can see that most of the effort was put into the drop, and that the rest of the track wasn't necessarily an afterthought, but it certainly wasn't the priority. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, just generally not a thing that I'm too into, as I'm always looking for atmosphere and stories in music, which for the most part isn't getting shown through drops of songs, and this song is no exception to that. But overall, while the song had a few interesting and unique things about it, behind its vocal chops it had no legs to stand on, as any other aspects of the song were really boring and forgettable. But on the other hand, it seems to be one of the pioneers of the vocal chop style that would lead to some truly incredible tracks down the line. And for those and a bunch more reasons, this song is going to be getting a 5 out of 10 from me, as the few massive positives of this track are unfortunately balanced out by many more minor negatives, leaving this track being pretty mediocre as a whole. But this track is nonetheless an interesting look into the strange and very polarizing world that is quite a bit of DotEXE's music. So let me know what you think of this track in the comments. Was I too harsh on it, or is this track really just boring after all? No matter what you have to say, I want to hear it, as communication between me and you guys is pretty much why I made this channel in the first place. The next review that you'll be seeing from me will be of Oblivion by Obsidia. But until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.